First thing to know about Ant is it's an Apache project, which is like, I don't know, however many dozens of others that are out there. It's a great project, been around for quite a while. Actually became an active project originally in 2000, so that puts us 18 years old. It's currently running version 1.10. Actually, I think 1.10.3 is the latest. If you go out to apache.org, you can see it in the list, or also if you go, I think it's ant.apache.org, you'll see it there. And also if you Google or Bing or however you want to search Apache Ant, you'll see it, and most likely the homepage will come up or something close to it. If not the homepage, usually the other one that comes up is the documentation for the latest version, which is not a bad thing either. It can get you started. It is a Java library. Ant is built on Java, which automatically makes it essentially cross-platform. It's a command line tool, and its primary focus is building and deploying files. That was way back when they started. That was what it did. It's extensible, so it's grown to a lot more stuff. There are a lot of extensions out there, some that have been rolled into the main Apache library and its core functionality. But then there's a lot of others that are out there that are essentially supported by Apache, just not necessarily out of the box. You'll have to go grab a jar file, basically, because it's Java. You have to grab a jar file, throw it in a library to include it in. But that's actually a really straightforward process. You just grab a file, drop it in a folder, and boom, you're off and running. Now, in this presentation, we're going to go through several different things. We're going to talk about just installation, getting started. We're going to look at just the general format, like just our first, sort of like a hello world. It's not going to be quite hello world, but basically a hello world form of an Ant script. Then we're going to get into adding the ability to copy files, tar or zip files together, look at variables within scripts, doing secure copies. So if you want to take your stuff and deploy it out to your server, if you want to work on your database server, we're going to look at executing SQL scripts and commands, how you do hookup. We're going to look at macros and then ability to hook up Git if you want to do that. So you could do a pull request, pull stuff down and build from there, firing off Javadoc and JUnit as far as executing tests. Now, the first thing with installation is you can get the latest version at ant.apache.org. I've got the link here. It's /bin download.cgi. Also, if you just go to ant.apache.org, it'll be right there at the top. You get a list of mirror sites. You can pick a mirror that's close to you, select that, go get the latest version. It's a Java application, so you don't have to worry about a complicated install script, depending whether you're Windows or Linux or Mac or whatever you are. So there are also, because it's a Java application, there is a minimum version of JVM, but essentially it goes all the way back to Java 5. So unless you're really on an old Java environment, you're going to be fine to run this. Every modern operating system out of the box is Java, I think 7 or 8 at least. If you're on the latest Mac, I think is 8. I'm pretty sure it's 8. It's at least 7 out of the box. I think it's actually now 8 out of the box. Windows 10 was, depending on what version you get, is 7 or 8 out of the box. Linux's, it depends on which distro you're working with, but most of them are minimum, Java 6 or 7 at least. And usually, I think 7's pretty much the common there. There may be a few older versions of distros, things like that you'll find older versions, but when in doubt, you can always upgrade Java if you need to. Wherever you install, and your installation is really just you grab it and drop the file somewhere. So it's going to be a zip file or a tar file or something like that. Install it wherever you need to. Maybe a lot of times on Windows, I'll just put it to C:\ant and put it in all the folders there. On a Unix kind of thing, I'm usually going to do it like /usr/local/ant, something like that. Or depends on how you want to do it. You may want to do user bin ant. Depends on how you, whatever your druthers are in that situation. Note where you install it, and then all you have to do is tell it, it'll go for a default Ant if it can, depending on what your environment is. When Linux and Mac or much more forgivable Windows, you're going to have to actually create in your properties an Ant home and point it to wherever you install it to that, so it knows where that to the bin directory. So if you install it to c:\ant, then your Ant home is going to be c:\ant /bin bin, because it wants to know where to find the Ant executable. And then from that, it's going to know to drop down a level and look for an lib, a lib folder, and that's where any libraries that you install, any additional extensions that you put, that's where it's going to look first. And then from there, it's going to follow general Java path rules. And of course, like any Java application, you can also, as part of firing off Ant, you can do class path modifications to allow it to find stuff wherever you need to find stuff. So general format. An Ant script is an XML file. And what we see here, we'll focus on the sort of highlighted area here at the top. You start off with a project, and in this case, I just called it Developerpreneur. Default is a task, target. What you'll see here is you can see some targets that I've listed. Actually, I've got 3 here. I've got a target called Basic, a target called Clean, and a target called All. Default is the target that if you don't give it a target, if you don't give it a property, if you just say run this script, if you have a default set, that's the one it's going to run. So in this case, I've done all, which is basically going to run everything. And we'll get a little bit further into these later on. So that's your default. If you don't do one, then you have to give it something in order for it to execute a task. Your base dir is dir is wherever you can set it up. So like here it says, well, whatever I refer to, I'm going to start with the directory that I'm running it from. But you could also set it up to run it from maybe your source directory. If you've got like a development source directory, if you've got a web directory somewhere, you've got a web path that you want to work everything from there. Maybe you've got a user home, things like that. You set that up as your base directory. That just allows you, sort of like any other scripting language that's at the operating system level, you want to give it a place to start from, and then that way everything can be relative from there. Now, a target is pretty straightforward. It's got a name. It's got to have a name. I think it will, basically it's not going to recognize, there's no way, otherwise it essentially doesn't exist. And if you give it a description, it's got the idea of a main and a secondary task. If it has a description, it assumes that's a main task. If it doesn't, then it's not, it doesn't assume that. It's going to assume it's a secondary one. That comes into play if you do an Ant command and you ask it for projects. And actually, although I said I wasn't going to pop out, I am going to pop out real quick and show an example of this. Let me blow this guy up quite a bit so we can see the, let me do it that way. Blow this up so we can see our fonts real well. So if I go into, where did I put it? If I go into my folder for this, which is called Ant class. Let me do a clear real quick. So if I just do, and Ant commands are actually really easy. So I just call it Ant. If I do it by itself, then it's going to come in and it's going to assume that there's a file called build.xml. And if I look, there is one there, but I also have several others. So I'm going to start with this basic, which we just saw. So in that case, I tell it -f and tell it which file I'm going to use, which is basic.xml. And I'm going to do -p, which says, tell me what are, give me a list of the targets. And so you can see here, the main targets. We saw these, it's basic, all, and clean. I can see what the default target is at the project level. And I've got my description for each of those. If I want to run, then all I have to do, same thing, is I'm going to say, I'm going to use this basic.xml file, and I'm going to use the basic task. And then it's running basic. So it tells me right here, what is the target that I ran. And here it tells me what did I run basically. And I did an echo, I did a message. I said, hey, I'm about to run it. And then I said, tell me what the time is that you complete. So let's go back and look at that. And you'll see here that when I ran basic, I've got the description. The first step it does here, and again, like a typical XML, you've got all of these little tags are going to show up. And so I've got 3 tags. First one is called echo, and there's a message. I tell it what the message is. I grab a timestamp, and with doing this little timestamp tag, it creates and updates this variable, which should look pretty familiar if you've used any C shell, T shell, or those kinds of TC shell, those kind of tiny ones, corn, all of those. It's a typical Unix corner format. Also, typical usually if you're using any kind of XML, it uses standard XML variables and access to them. So here it created this tstamp variable, and as you saw, it told me that it finished the build at, and then it gave me that timestamp. If I run one of these others, then I'm going to see slightly different. So like here, if I wanted to run clean, let's go ahead and do that real quick. Actually, let's look at it first. So if I run the clean, what it's going to do is it's going to give me a message that says I'm removing any extra files that are not star.xml. And then actually here, I'm going to do a delete command. And the command is delete, and it's going to come in and it creates a file set, which is, you can do a file or you can do a file set. A file set is where you're going to do anything that's actually going to include wildcards and things like that. So here my file set is setting a directory current, and I'm going to include everything that's got a name star.backup, and then I close out that tag, close out the delete. And in looking at that, if I run it, now what I don't have, if we look, let me do this. Let me do an ls first. And I did not have any files that have a name called backup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create one just to be sure. I'm going to copy CP basic 2. So now we can see that I've got it there. If I do an ant, until XMA, and I want it to do clean, then it's going to come through. It's going to get rid of anything. Actually, going to get rid of everything that's not star.xml. Oh wait, actually that wasn't exactly correct because it said it was looking back up, and you can see now that basic.backup has been deleted. Questions about the general format of just getting like a very basic Ant script out? Okay, here are none. Okay, here are none. Moving along. So as I mentioned, it's an XML file. Just did want to, just sort of cover a little bit. You've got your name, your default, and your base directory are part of a project. And if you have questions about any of these, of course, besides the templates, if you go out to the Ant documentation, I'll show you a little bit later, but it's actually really easy to use, really thorough. We've already looked at echo, which sends a message to the screen, and it even tells you that it's an echo when you look at it from the Ant output. So you can tell the difference between a message that was you asked it to display as part of your script versus output that comes from a build or some sort of other commands, because most of the commands do show you some output. So you can see here, nothing was affected when I did. Oh, I'm sorry, it was. So it came in, but I had it in silent. So all it did is it told me that it was going to remove the extra files. We'll see a little bit later where we're going to get some extra, a little more extensive output comes depending on what task, what target, and what key tag you're using. The target descriptions, as we noted, they're going to they show you that, hey, it's a main task. And I did not cover depends, but I want to show that here. I'll go ahead and show that now. What a depends does is it works from left to right and says, if I run this target, then the first thing it does before it runs this target is it's going to go left to right and run these other targets. So if I run all, it's going to say, oh, first I've got to run basic. So it's going to run up and run the basic task. And then when that completes, it says, oh, I got to run clean. So it's going to come in and run the clean task. And then it's going to actually run this task. So as you can see here, if I run all, it's going to run everything else. And then it's going to come in and tell me that it finished it, that it finished that. It's going to give me a finished build. So if I ran all, I'd actually see it twice, as it would run through basic. It would say that it finished it, but then it would actually go through and run clean, and then I get this finished again. Now, copying files happens quite a bit. We looked at deleting them. Copying is also pretty straightforward. So I can use this here. I actually use this quite often for a nice little backup program. If I want to back my files up, the nice thing is that with the way it does copies is you can actually overwrite stuff if you want to, or allow it to only copy if something has changed. So if you do a basic backup here, if you look at this target, most of the stuff, this is sort of continuing from the prior script. So if I come in with a backup, which all I want to do is copy the basic.xml file to basic.backup. That's a straightforward one. As I mentioned earlier, we saw a file set here when we did the clean, but here's with the single file. As I just say, copy, I give it the file, basic.xml, and then the to file, which is basic.backup. By default, it does it if it's only if it's newer. You can also, as a property, tell it to overwrite, which is and basically just say overwrite equals true. I did not include that, unfortunately, in this example. If you do that, then it's going to force it regardless. So it's, if I want to, which is excellent for, like I said, like file backups. I use that a lot where I've got like a source directory and I want to do a backup somewhere else just outside of source control and all that other kind of stuff. I just want to have that out there. Or also I use this a lot if I want to deploy, for example, to let's say I've got a HTML that I'm working on and I want to deploy it out to a web folder on the local machine. Well, what I can do is I'll just tell it to copy all the HTML, CSS, all those things, and it does. You can tell it to do recursive. So I'll tell it, copy all my source files out to wherever my web directory is. And what it'll do is it will only copy the ones that have changed. So I don't have to worry about it copying, if I've got 50 files, it's not going to copy 50 files every time. It's going to copy 2 or 3 of them, which is really nice because if I'm working on stuff and then I want to push it out, then I'm going to see as part of the output how many files were copied, and it allows me to say, oh yeah, I only had a couple files that changed, that makes sense. Or, maybe 0 files. I'm going to say, well, wait a minute, I thought I had made a change, and I'll go find out that, oh, I forgot to save a file. So it's a nice little, it's a quick way to get stuff deployed out to, wherever you want to deploy it to. If I want to copy to a new folder, then I can go use a file set. And again, I can use an include and exclude. So I can tell it, and you can see here, you have to use this little */ whatever. Basically, the * allows you to do, basically it tells you, hey, this is going to be a wildcard, and then you give it a wildcard after the /. And then here, I'm going to do anything that's not with a name that has .backup. We will jump out again real quick. And if I do the same thing I did before, if I do that with copy, whoops, I had a default. So you can see here where it actually ran again, because all was one. It did basic, it did clean, and it did all. So I still have that as my default. But let's do -P. What I'll see here is I added backup change, and let's see, clean exit, and then copy to new directory. So if I do the same thing and I'm going to do just backup, then I'm going to back up. It comes in, it does a clean just to make sure that I don't have an old backup file there. And then here, as part of that copy, it copied a file to this folder. And if I look, I'm going to see there's that basic.backup. If I want to do the same thing, and I'm going to copy new dir, then we can see here that I copied 27 files to the new folder directory. If I look here, I can see new folder. And because I had this docs folder, that's where you see I've got a whole bunch of files there. If I look to new folder, it's got everything there. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a source was the other thing that I pulled, because I had it pull everything, including, as we see here, it started XML. So it actually looked into source as well. So, and actually went way back. So it goes deeply into this stuff, and I can see pulled all of this files, all these files across. So if I go to new folder, source, you can see here, it pulled everything across. And if I go back to it, let's see, I don't think clean gets rid of it. So yeah, clean doesn't actually get rid of all that stuff. So there we go. So that was, we got there is we can do a simple copy of a file, or we can do a file set. And you can see here where I do a copy, and I'm copying it to the new folder directory. A nice little feature. Now there's copy has got probably about 30 or 40 options to it that you can throw in there. There's a whole lot of different things you can do based on like timestamps and how it copies files. This one's used a lot. Copy on, I'm sorry, fail on error is false. By default, it's true. And in that case, that means if for some reason I can't, if I can't go to that folder for some reason, like maybe I don't have enough space left on the drive, or I try to create a folder that for some reason it fails, maybe I don't have permissions or something like that. What fail on error does, if I set it to false, and that means that it's going to just try to copy it, period. It's not going to worry about it. If I leave fail on error to true, or I set it to true, then if somewhere along the way it has a problem, then it's actually going to just bail out of the whole Ant script. And that's like, it's a critical, fault at that point. It's going to stop. So if I'm running a whole bunch of different targets, if I've got a whole series of targets I'm running, I may not want it to fail on error, because I may say, well, even if it doesn't get these tasks done, I want to go ahead and execute the other ones. You may have that on like on a compile or something like that. But thinking about it, same example, on a compile, usually if you have an error while compiling your file, you don't want it to go ahead and copy stuff out. Or like if you're copying things out, if it has one or two it fails on, you actually want it to just stop and say, all right, I'm going to go and rerun the whole copy, unless you happen to run like maybe you're running like huge files that you're copying across to a server, and you say, hey, if one fails, that's okay. I want to go ahead and run through all of them, and then I'll find out after the fact that it failed, and I'll copy that one file or rerun that one task. Any questions on copying? Hearing none?
No questions.
Okay, hearing none, then we'll move along here. Grouping and compressing is actually also very simple. You can see here I've got two different examples. One where I'm going to actually I'm going to tar a file up, which uses the tar command or tag, and then another one here is I've got a zip, which is which actually going to compress it. The zip is using a default for the operating system, so it's whatever it's basically the Unix default zip if you're on Unix or Mac, and it uses Windows compress, which I think is also is a zip format if you're on Windows. For tarring a file, it's tar. It may not. Haven't played around that with Windows like out of the box. I'm not sure these days if you can actually tar a file if it's Windows out of the box. You have to have you have to have a tar command. It has to recognize it, and I'm not sure if Windows 10 does that properly for you. So your mileage may vary on that one, but it's pretty straightforward. You can see here with this one, I came in, I created did a quick message. I deleted the tar file that existed, and then I turn around and I just say, take everything that I've got and create pkg.tar. Similar thing I did with the zip files. I said, hey, I want to delete the zip file if it exists, but then I'm going to turn right around and I'm going to create it in the local directory. Doing that, what you can see here in my local directory, I do have those because I ran those earlier. And you can see I've got an April 12th date. But if I come in and run pkg.xml, and so if I run the, what did I call that? I called it pkg, and then I call it, so if I run pkg, which creates the tar file, they're going to see here that it runs through. It actually did basic and clean because I just, for some reason, left those as depends. But you can see here where I deleted the file. I deleted pkg.tar, and then it turns around and it tells me that it's creating that tar file. And so now if I look, I'm going to see that that tar file actually now has this April 23 date instead of the 12th. Same thing, if I do the zip, then you can see where I executed basic clean, then I turn around and I deleted the pkg .zip file and went ahead and created it. And here it is. And of course, you can see here as well, the tar file obviously a little bigger versus the zip file, which actually compresses things. Tar and zip, much like the copy, whole lot of different options that you can do there. I like to stick to the simple stuff, but with both of those, there's some things that you may run into regularly where, for example, there are options to tell it to just update an existing zip file instead of, like I did here, I blew it away and recreated one. If you've got a huge zip or tar file, you may not want to do that. You may want to only update the changes. That's an option that you can do. The zip actually can get very complicated very quick, as I mentioned. Similar to copy, it has a lot of stuff where it's related to whether you want to update or not, whether you want to fail, whether you want to do, there's some formatting and things like that it will do. You can actually include some extra files, some things that zip files do, like you can secure it, things like that. All of those, some pretty cool options on zipping and tar. Before questions, I'll go ahead and dive into script variables because we've seen a little bit of this, but I wanted to look at those. Up to this point, when we've looked at some of the examples, like the directory, I've just used the dot to show that it's current directory. What you can do at the start, really anywhere at the project, but usually you want to do it, I guess maybe this is convention for myself at least, is you can declare some properties. And you can see here where I created 3 properties. I've got a source.dir, and you can see that you can call it, make the name pretty much whatever you want it to be. It does have some restrictions, but it's basic XML. So you can put just about anything in there as long as it doesn't look like a tag or like a $ bracket, because that will confuse the living daylights out of it. So I created 3 here. I've got the source directory that I just set its value to be current directory. Target directory, I said, well, I'm going to call that new folder. And then this is something we're going to actually look at a little bit later when I do secure copy, but I have this thing called server. You see here, actually, I've given it a rob at rbprod/home/rob. So I actually gave it something I'm going to use, which you would probably look pretty familiar if you do SCP on a regular basis. So its really value can be any string, and it just does a string replacement. So if I come down here, you can see where I've got source.dir. If I look up here, that's actually the current one. So I just went in and did a simple replace there. This becomes really useful, and I will jump out for a second and jump ahead. If we look at one of the larger ones like build.xml, you can see here where I've got some names that I've got some larger, I've got some fully qualified folders here, and I've assigned those out. I've actually got a Git repository. I've got that thing all assigned out, and that allows me to use some variables through here. And you can even do them on top of each other. So for example, here I can go to the root directory. I'm deleting a tar file, and you can see where I go from the root directory / the tar file. And I turn right around and I create it. And then I can also, here's where I'm pulling stuff from. So like anything else, variables are nice to have, so you don't have to repeat stuff all over the place. It's not that important if you're doing like just one target and done, but if you're gonna have a lot of targets, or if you want to essentially have like a nice little template where I'm going to have a bunch of targets I'm going to use over and over again, makes it obviously real nice to use properties. It does allow the ability to actually throw stuff out into a property file, include that. I'm not going to show an example of that, but it's just so you know that it actually can it can allow you to do some pretty cool stuff. For example, here where I've got a whole lot of different XML files, Ant files that I'm working with, what I could do instead of reproducing property, source dir, target dir, and server all over the place, I could extract those values out to one little property file, import that for each of them, and then I've got my variables off and running. And it'll allow you to mix them as well. So I could have script level variables and also have, for example, or script level properties and variables. And I could also do them across like a folder, or maybe it's something even across an enterprise where I just say, okay, here's some properties, because they may be things. For example, if you're securely connecting somewhere, they may be some key, some passphrases. It may be links to some key files, things like that. Before moving into Ant libraries, any questions about compressing and tars and variables?
I was going to ask.
Oh, go ahead.
Was there a way to use specifically when you're talking about those compressions and essentially just formatting? Is there a way to link all that up with Git so that, or did I see that as part of something that's going to go on later? Just some version control, so
you could do it. What you would do is, and we'll look at Git a little bit. We're going to really just sort of touch on Git, because basically what you end up doing is creating a macro. So you could use any Git command that you want to, but what you would do typically is you'd have a Git command, a target that would be, go pull all your files down from Git, and then you turn around, you have another target. Maybe we're going to compress those, or maybe you want to compress like log files or something like that you would turn around, and maybe you just say, hey, it's basically just a binary file I want to store back up to Git. So you could actually compress all of those things up and then send that up to Git if you wanted to. But all of these you can definitely mix and match them however you need to really to heart's desire.
I see. Good deal.
Excellent. So I showed you a little bit, sort of tease the idea of the SCP, and so now we'll actually take a look at that, at creating an SCP target. It does require, this is one of those, it's an extension that is not out of the box. You're not going to be able to use SCP. The nice thing is with the documentation in Ant, they tell you this is not natively used. You're going to have to go get this jar file. And it does require the ant-jsch jar file. There's a couple different places you can pull it, but I added a link here in case you guys want to pull it down. All you have to do is copy that jar file into the Ant lib folder. And for example, when we get into SQL, this is also going to be where you put your database drivers. So if you look on mine, let me clear this up real quick. I think, let's see, where did I put Ant? User local Ant. So if I look at my Ant folder, I'm going to see there's an lib folder. And if I look in there, what you'll see is here I pulled the JSCH. I pulled that jar file down. And then also you'll see somewhere in here where like I use MySQL, because I'm actually using MySQL. And there's a couple others that I've used, this JCraft, JSCAD, that's an older version of that jar file. But like, a lot of Java library folders that you'll see where you may see some older versions of jars floating around, because people like me don't always clean up all of their older stuff. You see here's a whole bunch of stuff that, a whole bunch of libraries, that are commonly included with Apache. A lot of pretty cool stuff. It's got, log4j, it pulls that in right away. Antler, a couple others, JUnit, some of those are right there, right away. But then some of these, you got to go out and get your own. So SCP is actually pretty straightforward. Where did I put it? Whoops. That's the head one. It's going to go to server. Where is server? Here it is. Okay, yeah. Sorry, so SCP. It's actually pretty straightforward. It's again, you just call the SCP task. You tell it's basically just like a copy at this point. Is I'm going to tell it what is the file. So in this case, you can see where I'm going to pull this tar file out. I'm going to send it actually out to server, and so you can see here, server is me at my server, and then this is the folder, typical SCP : and then the folder out on the server. So that's where it's going to go. And then I got to give it a key file because it is a secure file, a secure copy. I have to tell it what's the key file that I'm going to use for my access. In this case, I've already set myself up so it uses a key file on. It's used to using a trusted user on the server. And then trust is equal to true because it's going to say, look, I don't have to, because I set up this key file on the server, that means I don't have to actually enter a password. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then basically when you do an SCP, it's going to say what's your user and your password. So I use this to allow me to, I could batch this up, I could automate it, I could do it as a cron job. And generally speaking, I'm lazy, so that means I don't have to enter my user ID and password every time. SCP, much like copy, and we talked about the tar and zip, whole lot of different options for it. Very similar to copy to allow you to do things like, do you override it? Do you not override it? Do you fail on, do you stop on failure or not? Things like that. It's one of those things that it doesn't come out of the box, but it's incredibly useful if you're doing deployments. And I use this. Like this, what you see here is sort of close to a template I use on a regular basis whenever I launch a new PHP project. Actually, I use those quite a bit where I set it up so that I can deploy right to my web server locally, as I mentioned earlier, with a copy. So it allows me to just copy everything out to a folder on the web server, and boom, I'm ready to go. If I work out of my source directory, which is tied to Git. Then I execute this, copy stuff out to my local web folder so I can actually take a look at it live. And then I also have an SCP, which what I do is basically like here is I tar it up. Probably should zip it up, but for some reason I tar it, tar those files up, and then I SCP them out to my server. And then on the server side, I've got a little script that just basically unpacks the tar and throws it out wherever it needs to. I could do the same thing with zip where we'd unzip it and then throw out where it needs to be. Allows me to quickly, like literally within a couple of seconds, essentially, depending on how many files I'm working with, how big my website is. And within a matter of seconds, it allows me to pull stuff out and send it out to the server. A good example, just to show you, if I go to this guy, this is not a tiny application. See that it's got it's got, I don't know, dozens of files. And I've actually got quite a bit pulled into this, but if I go in and wanted to do here, for example, so deploy actually copies the change files to the target. If I do an ant deploy, oops, I'm sorry, that's not the one I want. I want to do package because that's the one, so deploy copies it actually out to my web folder. If I want to do package, it actually does the deploy. And then you can see here where it comes in, it deletes the tar file, builds the tar file, actually sends that tar file out to the server. So I can see SCP, it connects to the server, done, and 5 seconds after I started, I've actually got that file out on my server. So if I were to SSH out to there, out on that server, I can see here on April 24th, I just created this tar file and then set that out. So it's pretty quick, and it just pulled all my stuff, threw it out on my server, and I could be off and running in no time. You also use it quite a bit. I've done I used it a lot at a prior company when I had like 2 or 3 development servers that I was deploying stuff to, and then like there's like a test server, a stage server, a production server. And I had it set up so every one of those was a target. So I could say, deploy dev 1, deploy dev 2, deploy dev 3, deploy test 1, whatever. But I also had one where I could just say deploy all. And when we were ready to update everything, I could do that, and it would just send that file out to all those different servers, and it was off and running. Depending on what your access is, you can do like I do here, where I just send the file. I send it, which I sort of like to do. I send the tar file out to the server, and then I go jump on the server and actually deploy it. So I don't, but I could actually directly deploy it onto the server if I wanted to, particularly like Java. If you're using WAR files, which I did for this customer, for this company I work for, I would have it build the WAR file, and then I would zip it, send it out to all of the different places I need to send it out to, unzip it on the other side, and then boom, it's off and running. And it would just, I have it. And actually, for a while, even I didn't even zip it. I'd send the WAR file out, had it set up to auto deploy on the Java server on the other end, and it's off and running. So I could actually deploy to multiple machines in a matter of seconds, basically. I've mentioned the things that you can. There's a lot of different parameters and a lot of different properties. This one happens to be actually from the Ant documentation. This is for SCP. So you can see here where I have a file. It has some alternates here, so I could actually call it local file instead of file. I could call it remote file if I wanted to. And you can see here where it's like, since Ant 1.6.2, here's some things that it's done. I can connect on a certain port. I can tell it to trust or not. I can include known hosts. I can do fail on error. I can put a password in there if I want to put it there instead of asking it. I can actually, by default, it doesn't use SFTP, which is SSH2. It is recommended this be set to true if you're copying to a server that doesn't support SCP1. So you see there's just all kinds. There's a file mode, directory mode, server alive interval. So you can do some timeouts. You can compress it, all kinds of good stuff like that. And there's actually, I think, a few more options. This is what a typical Ant task document looks like. As you can see, it's actually very thorough. It tells you what all the attributes are, gives you a nice description of them, and then even tells you whether it's required, and if not, it tells you what the default values are as well. So really excellent documentation. I think a lot of the Apache projects do have it, but Ant's one of those that you need it, and good enough, lucky enough that it exists as well. When in doubt, we talked about that. We've got all these little targets and tasks that we've talked about. When in doubt, if you do a search on the task name and then Ant tasks, like SCP Ant task or FTP Ant task, or you name it. Particularly if it's a Unix type command, like you could probably do grep Ant task, and you're going to see something that's going to give you at least an idea of it, because the documentation is pretty solid and it's a pretty active user community. Those will get you examples quickly, and most of the commands are in that format I just showed you. So you just throw a tag out, give it some properties, maybe a couple options, boom, you're off and running. Any questions so far? Hearing none. SQL. Another nice thing. This is one of the things they added it on somewhere along the way. I don't think this existed initially, but it was pulled into the core functionality pretty quick, because you think about it, if you're building and deploying, one of the things you may want to do is build and deploy to a database. So what I've got here is a SQL example. It's actually what you would expect is you start out and you've got to give it, you tell it SQL. You got to give it a driver. And I showed you earlier that I had the mysql.jar that I had to pull into the, drop into the lib folder. And you do have to do that for whatever you're going to use. So if I wanted to use Oracle, I'd have to throw the OJDBC, or if I want to do Microsoft SQL Server, I'd have to use that one. and then I'm going to tell it what driver. Pretty much anything, it's very, this looks very standard if you've used Java and tried to connect to a database before. Conveniently enough, since it's a Java application, it connects to a database just like normal Java does. So I'm going to use the JDBC driver. I tell it, as usual, this is a MySQL guy. I'm connecting to the local server. Here's my database. I give it a user ID and a password, which, typical. And then in this case, I'm telling it the source is this SQL file. So in this case, I'm going to run mydbsource.sql. So this command says, just go run that file. If I want to run a actual SQL command and don't want to put it into a script, then it's our old friend, a C data block that you see in XML all the time. And basically it says, if you don't know, basically what this tells it is what follows, what's between these brackets is just some straight up data. Don't do anything to it. It's no tags or anything like that. Ignore the tags. Just take that data and do a brute force replace when you need to do so. So here's what I did is I said, hey, I'm just going to update some data, some table. I set a column to column +1 where the column 2 is less than 42. So I could do anything. I can do inserts, I can do updates, I can do deletes, I could create procedures, I can do all kinds of stuff here. Obviously, if you're going to have a huge C data block, I have no idea why you would not instead, pull it out into a SQL file or just a file somewhere and tell it to execute that file as opposed to having some big complex thing. I had to look this guy up. I knew you could do it, but I've not done this ever, I don't think. I've always just said, forget it. I'm going to run my SQL file. And I use that example here that I showed earlier with that build is somewhere down here. It's actually used I had a target that I called DB reset. And basically what I do there is I come in and I'm going to drop and rebuild the database. So I come in and call the SQL, which actually happens to do that. Which actually it's all in one script. If I looked at that script file, do I have it here? I do not. Let me do it this way. Whoops. So you can see here, this is a full-blown SQL script, and you can see here it comes in and it says, whoops, and it comes in and it says, hey, I'm going to drop it and I'm going to create it. And okay, whoops. So that's SQL. Any questions about SQL? Excellent. Moving along, we're going to get to Git. And actually here, this is actually anything that you want to do that becomes, that you want to extend it. One of the things that allows you to do is create macros. And what we've got here is we actually created 2 macros. And essentially what we're doing is we're just going to, and of course, along with this, I guess I'll start with this one. It does allow you to do an exec, which allows you to actually do an operating system level command. So we've got, these are just easier to just copy and use yourself as opposed to digging too deeply into them. But essentially what we're doing here is we're going to execute the git command on whatever directory is sent, and we're going to give it the command. And you can see here with the macro, you give it a name, which we're going to call it git, the attribute, and it's got another attribute. So the 2 things it's going to be given are command and directory. You can give it a default, and then you've got, whoops, that was too big. And then you've got a couple, arguments and things like that you can send across. And so, this is a good one. I would say just copy and paste them because it's pretty straightforward. What I've got here is I've just got 2 commands that I've hooked up. I've got git clone poll, which first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the get command clone, which will send that clone across. If you're familiar with the get, you've done a get clone before and you've done a get pull before. And so what you can see here is if I do a clone and a pull, then it's going to come in. I've got to give it a repository and a destination. And then here's a sequential of basically which says call these things in order. So it's going to call clone, and then it's going to come through and it's going to call pull. So all that being said, once I've created this clone pull, I give it a repository, I give it a destination, and it's going to go in and pull from there. So if I do grab source, I'll jump into here. I don't remember what that was called. I called it I think I called it build. Does he have grab source? Yes, he does. So if I do grab source, then what I'm going to see is it's going to pull. So now I gave it a repository. It tries to do a clone, but because that already exists, it doesn't like that. And then it says, okay, I'm going to skip it, no big deal. And then it gives me, I'm going to do a pull, and it was already up to date. If I go in and delete source, I think is what I called it. Whoops. Then it's going to go ahead and try to clone it in a source. And then I could, so this would be a great example. I could take this, I could compress it, I could do some stuff with it, I could compile it. There's a whole lot of good things I could do with it. Questions about Git? Moving right along. The last two, we're going to talk about Javadoc and testing, which is through JUnit. Very similar. These essentially what they do is they just give you extensions into calling Javadoc or running JUnit tests. The Javadoc one is pretty nice because it's going to go through and it's got a whole lot of properties it can use. For example, you can set up whatever your title is going to be. You can set up whatever's going to be on the bottom. You can do a lot of stuff with like some of the tags that exist. You can have some links that are going to build, that it's going to try to build out there. So if I come in, I already ran this earlier, so I'm just going to jump out to that and actually take a look at it. So I go to docs. So I ran this and it generated, as Javadoc does, generated all of this. And then it comes in, I ran this against some source I've got. And then of course you can see here where it put that footer everywhere. The title you can't see because of the way it's set up, but it titles it. And then of course just, it went through and did your general. Here's all of my stuff. Here's all of my Javadoc. So jump back over here. And as usual, like I said, Javadoc's one that I would definitely recommend that, I guess, if you want to, if you're actually utilizing it and want to do an update to it, you want to take a look at it, look at all the properties that allows all of the values that Javadoc has, because it's extensive and it's something that you probably want to use it to really customize your Javadocs completely. JUnit, I'm not going to get as deep into that because it also, like Javadoc, has got lots of different ways that you can do stuff. I will get you some of the basics, is that JUnit is going to allow you to print a summary, which is basically it's going to run all of your tests, and it's going to say, hey, 5 of them failed, 2 of them were successful, stuff like that. It has forking, so it allows you to actually run, if you're going to run a whole bunch of different tests, like in this case, I've got 2 different tests. If you allow it to fork, it's going to actually launch 2 separate JVMs, run both of them, and get the responses back. Halt on failure, exactly what it would expect. If you get a failed test, then it's going to stop. This is something where very often you're going to say don't, because what you're going to do is you're going to run all your tests and then see what happens. If you do it as a series, though, which I have done that before, where it's part of my build process, I will go have a JUnit target as part of it. That happens maybe, maybe I do the compile and then I do the run all the tests. And then assuming the tests are successful, I would allow it to deploy out. Well, I'm going to do a halt on failure in that case because I'm going to say, hey, if I have a failed test, then I'm going to stop right there. It allows you to use formatters so you can do some, again, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but you can actually go in and format out all of your outputs. Lots of examples are included in JUnit with the, I will jump out to that. So if I go out to Ant Task JUnit, just like I mentioned, then you can see that it's, there's a lot of properties that it allows, and they've got a ton of examples as you get down here. Like you can see here, like this is one big JUnit one, and it tells you what, hey, if I want to do this, here's what I can do. There's a lot of different ways that you can work with JVMs. You can do setup, you can do teardown, all that kind of stuff, all the things that, if you're a regular JUnit user, it's going to allow you to, essentially just script all of that good stuff out. And nice little sound effect there. All right, before we go to the last one there, any questions on JUnit or basically any of the tasks we've covered at this point? Hearing none. All right, first thing is, in working with your scripts, take it step by step. It's sort of like I've done here. Start with something very simple, copy some files. Maybe you want to do some compiling and some things like that. Maybe try an exec here or there if you want to do some source operating system level command. You don't have to go get crazy with it. Get comfortable with them over time. You're going to have some core tasks, copying, deleting, things like that. Maybe, tarring, zipping. And then just, basically sort of keep it in mind. So as if you really want to master Ant, then you take it step at a time, build on it, get comfortable with it, and then go out to some new ones. As I mentioned several times now, documentation and examples are your friends. This thing is incredibly well documented, tons of examples, and that's just what they provide. If you want to, if you start going out and searching the net, it's been around, like I said, almost 20 years. There are tons of examples out there, a lot of good stuff that the developers before you have run into. I probably could have started off with this, but I want to sort of wrap it up. But some great uses for Ant. If you're like, well, what am I going to do with this? As I mentioned, backup strips, I use them all the time. There's a lot of places where I go out. I will use Ant to create some really cool backup scripts, and then I'll just have cron jobs that execute those guys. If you want to do database updates, imports, exports, things like that, either related to backup or related to deployment, great way to use Ant scripts. Obviously, automating any common admin tasks. Since you have that ability to exec out to operating system commands, I actually have gotten, so I use Ant in a lot of cases. If it's a very simple shell script command, yeah, I may use it, but if I want to get complicated, because there's a lot of stuff I haven't even gotten into where there is like logically, you have like if-then logic and stuff like that you can include in your scripts. So actually, they can be just as powerful as shell scripts out there, but to me, they're easier to use, easier to read. Unless you're just really deep into shell scripts, and if it's somebody that's not comfortable with shell scripts, just the natural way that XML is easier to understand than scripting languages in general makes it, an excellent script language, shell script replacement basically. And along with all that, the nice thing is it's cross-platform. So if you're which I've run into a lot of times, if you're developing on one operating system, for example, Windows, and you're deploying to another, for example, like Linux or some Unix, then they're actually able to sort of do you can basically just take the script, do it once, and copy it out to your server, save a couple, change a couple property names, and boom, you're off and running. That will do it for the diving into Ant. As always, appreciate the time. Love to discuss any of this further. If you have questions, as always, you can add comments, you can throw some suggestions, you can contact us in email, you can hit us out on our forum, Twitter, Facebook, all of that good stuff. um, even if it's something that I haven't done in the world of Ant, more than happy at this point I'd love to just say, yeah, let's go research that together, because like I said, it's like every time I use something there, I'll stumble across an extension or something I hadn't used before, and suddenly some light bulbs go on. It's like, wow, here's some more uses of it. Questions or comments?
You mentioned other things I'm sorry, you may have mentioned it during the presentation, but another tool that kind of uses Ant is Jenkins to deploy those particular, if you tar up a file or something like that. Jenkins is a good kind of server tool to use as well.
Yeah, actually, I didn't really mention some of the stuff, but Jenkins and Ivy is actually has Ant at its core as well, and that's again, yeah, it's because it's such an old project, since it's been around so long. You do see it pop up in a lot of the newer Apache stuff, because they like to or drink their own Kool-Aid, I guess it is, or whatever. They'll use their own tools and build on top of them. There's a lot of, I was looking at it, and I think Eclipse may have dropped it for a long time. Eclipse, as part of its export to like a runnable jar file, I think the runnable jar file still does. It used to be a runnable, if you wanted to export to WAR file, one of the options that they had was that whatever they're doing in the background, you had an option to say build an Ant script to do this. And so it's probably what they're doing on the back end, and they would just expose it so that you could actually use that Ant script and then just run it from the command line from there on out. So there's a lot of things like that where you'll find some, there are newer tools, there's Maven and stuff like that, but there's a lot of stuff that still uses Ant just because that was what was available at the time, and it's solid. It's been around a long time. You don't have to worry about the new versions changing very much. They may deprecate some stuff here and there, and they do have some things that change, mostly based on what they're forced to do on the JVMs that they support.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah. Ask you, what is is there like a huge difference on the regular Apache server?
You broke up there just on could you repeat the question?
Oh, no, I was saying, like, is there like a huge difference between the regular, the known Apache server and Apache Ant?
Oh,
server?
Apache server is actually a completely different project. Ant is it's a build tool. It's not actually it's not a server or anything like that. It's just actually, and if you look at it, so if I go back to user local Ant, if you go to the binary file, I think you'll just see. Yeah, actually, I guess it's there's some Perl stuff to run it, but basically what it does is, well, let's see. I don't think it's, if I go ant.cmd. Yeah, it's a little longer than I thought it was, but basically at the end of the day, what you'll see is that it's just calling somewhere in here. Shoot, I don't see it right away, but basically it's just all it is. Yeah, here it is. It's just a Java application. So it just comes in and it has this ant launcher.jar, which is the actual file. And actually you can see here, otherwise here's where it's at. So it's, as opposed to Apache, which I guess is actually, I don't know if, I guess I can't remember. I don't think Apache, I don't think is a Java application. But Ant is, so it's really just a straight up Java application, closer to Tomcat.
Okay.
But in this case, it doesn't actually launch a server or anything like that. It just runs a script. So it's definitely a completely different tool. And you'll find that with Apache, the Apache project does have the web server, which is they renamed it at some point to, I guess now called Apache HTTPD or something like that. I forget what although, if you install it, you'll see it's Apache 2, but I think the official name is like Apache Web Server, because Apache org has got a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with the web server. If you go out to apache.org, you'll see that there's a whole lot of Apache projects.
Gotcha.
And they've got libraries, they've got obviously the web server, they've got add-ons to the web server, they've got templates, and of course Apache Commons has got all sorts of stuff. There's a ton of stuff there. I think this will give me a list. No, it does not give me a straight up list, but there's a whole lot of stuff there that's basically libraries to help you. I mean, and you use them all the time if you're in Java development. There's a lot of those out there that'll allow you to do things like there's some collections, there's some iterators, there's file manipulation. There's just all kinds of stuff out there. So yeah, Apache org is there's the Apache project, which is just a huge open source project. Everything there is open source. And then Ant just happens to be one of the projects of theirs. Any other questions or comments? All right. That being said, we will wrap this one up. It's a sort of in closing, this was one of those things that it fit very well for a presentation, just the amount of information that we could cover to give you probably more than you've worked with before, but it also serves, I think, as a pretty good teaser that there's a lot out there on Ant, sort of as a wrapping it up in that sense. If you go out to Apache Ant Documentation, I think it's got the Ant tasks. If you do the list of tasks, you can see that it's actually got pages and pages of tasks that are out there that you can use. It's just I just sort of scratched the surface on some that happen regularly. It does have some that are older ones as well that you're going to see here, but like I said, there's a lot of pretty powerful stuff it can do. And I didn't even get into like all of the Java. You can Javadoc I talked about, but you can actually do your compilations there. You can actually run Java applications. Whole lot of other good stuff out there. So take a look at it. And like I said, I'm always happy to hear if you come across a task, you're like, wow, this is something I should have used before. Love to hear it, because I'm sure at some point I'll need to do it need to use it as well.